Midnight, 1867. The world outside is a hush of black branches and frostbitten silence. The kind of night that presses against the windows and seeps beneath the doors. In the heart of a small New England town, a single lamp flickers in the darkness, its glow barely holding back the shadows. It is on such a night that the impossible happens. A boy, no more than 12, is found wandering the edge of the woods, barefoot and silent, his eyes wide with a knowledge that chills the marrow. His name is Timothy Caldwell, though no one in town has ever seen him before, and no one can say where he came from. The constable who first lays eyes on Timothy will later swear that the boy's skin seemed almost luminous in the moonlight, as if he were not entirely of this world. The doctor, summoned in haste, will find no wounds, no fever, no sign of hunger or thirst only, a pulse that beats too slow, and a gaze that never quite meets his own. The townsfolk, roused from uneasy sleep, gather in whispers and candlelight, their curiosity quickly curdling into fear. For, in Timothy's presence, clocks falter, dogs whimper, and the air itself seems to thicken with a strange, electric dread. What follows is a story that will unravel the fabric of certainty, a tale that will pit science against superstition, reason against terror, and compassion against the primal urge to destroy what cannot be understood. Tonight, you will hear the account of Timothy Caldwell, the boy science couldn't explain. And by the end, you may find yourself questioning the very nature of reality, and wondering what secrets still linger in the shadows, waiting to be found. In the spring of 1867, the wounds of the Civil War were still raw, stitched together with uneasy truces and the brittle hope of a nation desperate to heal. New England, with its rolling hills and ancient forests, wore its scars quietly. The town of Ashford, nestled between the shadowed pines and the restless river, was a place where the past clung to every stone and every soul. Its streets were lined with saltbox houses, their clapboards weathered by decades of harsh winters and harder lives. The church steeple, white against the sky, stood as both a beacon and a warning, a reminder that faith and fear often walked hand in hand. Ashford was a town suspended between centuries. The war had brought change, yes, but it had also left behind a residue of uncertainty. Men who had marched off as boys returned with haunted eyes and stories they would never tell. Women, who had kept the town alive in their absence, now watched the world shift beneath their feet. Children played in the graveyard, weaving games from the names etched in lichen-covered stone, their laughter echoing through the misty mornings. Yet, for all its history, Ashford was not untouched by the spirit of progress. The telegraph had arrived, its wires strung like veins across the countryside, promising connection and knowledge. Newspapers from Boston and New York found their way into the general store, their headlines brimming with tales of invention and discovery. There was talk of electricity, of steam engines, of a future shaped by science and reason. The town's physician, Dr. Elias Morton, kept a shelf of medical journals in his study, their pages filled with the latest theories and marvels. The schoolmaster, Mr. Hargrove, lectured his pupils on Darwin and Faraday, urging them to question, to seek, to believe in the power of the mind. But beneath this veneer of enlightenment, older currents ran deep. The woods that hemmed Ashford were thick with legend stories of witches, of lights that danced above the bogs, of voices that called from the darkness. It began, as so many stories do, with a single, inexplicable event. On the night of April 17th, as a cold wind rattled the shutters and the moon hung low and yellow over the pines, a farmhand named Samuel Pike was returning from the tavern, his lantern swinging in the dark. He was not a man given to fancy, but what he saw at the edge of the woods would haunt him for the rest of his days. There, standing barefoot in the dew-soaked grass, was a boy thin, pale and silent, his hair the color of old straw, his eyes wide and unblinking. He wore a shirt several sizes too large, its sleeves hanging past his wrists, and trousers cinched with a length of twine. He did not shiver, though the night was bitter, nor did he speak when Samuel called out to him. Samuel, torn between fear and pity, led the boy back to town, his hand resting gently on the child's shoulder. Timothy followed without protest, his steps light, almost soundless. When they reached the constable's house, the boy stood in the doorway, gazing at the flickering lamplight as if he had never seen such a thing before. He answered questions with a slow, deliberate nod or shake of the head, but no words passed his lips. When asked his name, he hesitated, then whispered, "Timothy Caldwell." The name meant nothing to anyone in Ashford, and no Caldwell family could be found in the county records. The doctor was summoned, and Timothy was examined by lamplight. His skin was cool to the touch, his pulse slow but steady. He bore no marks of injury or neglect, yet there was something uncanny about him and absence. A stillness, as if he were listening to a music no one else could hear. He did not flinch at the touch of cold instruments, nor did he react to the doctor's gentle prodding. When offered food, he ate sparingly, picking at the bread and cheese with delicate fingers, his gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the walls. Word spread quickly through Ashford. By morning, the town was abuzz with speculation. Some said he was a runaway from a distant cit. At first, the oddities surrounding Timothy Caldwell were subtle, the kind of things that could be explained away by nerves or coincidence. Mrs. Abernathy, ever practical, dismissed the cat's refusal to enter the attic as mere feline caprice. The grandfather clocks lost minutes, she reasoned, were the result of age and dust. But as the days passed, the peculiarities multiplied, each one more difficult to ignore, each one chipping away at the town's fragile sense of normalcy. It began with the weather. On mornings when Timothy awoke before dawn, a strange mist would settle over Ashford, thick and low, muffling sound and swallowing the sun. The mist would linger until Timothy descended the attic stairs, at which point it would dissipate as if banished by his presence. The townsfolk, accustomed to the caprices of New England weather, found themselves glancing skyward with unease, whispering that the air felt different charged, somehow, with a restless energy. Then there were the animals. Dogs that had once barked at every passing stranger now cowered in their yards, tails tucked, eyes fixed on the Abernathy house. Horses balked at the end of the lane, refusing to pass the garden gate. Even the crows, those black-winged sentinels of the town, abandoned their perches on the church steeple, circling high above as if wary of something unseen. Mrs. Abernathy's hens, usually reliable layers, ceased producing eggs altogether, their clucks replaced by uneasy silence. The townspeople began to notice changes in Timothy himself. His skin, always pale, seemed almost translucent in certain lights, the blue veins beneath visible like delicate rivers. His eyes, a grey so light they bordered on silver, reflected the world with an unsettling clarity. He never seemed to tire, no matter how long he worked in the garden or how late he read by the window. He ate little, drank less, and never once complained of hunger or thirst. When he slept, it was with a stillness that unnerved Mrs. Abernathy, who would sometimes stand in the doorway, watching for the rise and fall of his chest, uncertain if he was breathing at all. Word of these oddities reached Dr. Morton, who prided himself on his rational mind and modern methods. He requested a second examination, this time in the presence of the town's elders. Timothy submitted without protest, sitting quietly as the doctor checked his pulse, his temperature, his reflexes. Everything appeared normal, almost to normal. His heartbeat was slow but steady, his skin cool but not cold. Yet when Dr. Morton pricked Timothy's finger to draw a drop of blood, the wound closed almost instantly, leaving no trace. The doctor, flustered, tried again, but the result was the same. The elders exchanged uneasy glances, their confidence in science beginning to waver. The schoolmaster, Mr. Hargrove, attempted to test Timothy's knowledge, presenting him with puzzles and questions meant to confound even the brightest pupils. Timothy answered each one with quiet precision, sometimes offering solutions that seemed beyond his years. When asked to recite a passage from the Bible, Timothy did so flawlessly, but in a voice that seemed to echo with an odd resonance, as if another, older voice spoke through him. The schoolmaster, unsettled, ended the lesson early, his hands trembling, as he gathered his books. As the days wore on, the phenomena grew more pronounced. Lights flickered and dimmed when Timothy entered a room. Mirrors clouded over, reflecting not his image but a shifting, indistinct shadow. Mrs. Abernathy's prized roses, which had survived countless winters, withered overnight, their petals blackened as if touched by frost. The air in the attic grew heavy, thick with a scent no one could name, a blend of earth and ozone, sharp and metallic. The townsfolk, once content to gossip from a distance, now found themselves drawn to the Abernathy house, compelled by a mixture of fear and fascination. Some brought gifts, bread, preserves, a knitted scarf, hoping to curry favor or ward off misfortune. Others came with questions, their voices hushed, their eyes darting. Timothy greeted each visitor with the same quiet courtesy, his expression unreadable, his answers vague. He seemed both present and absent, as if part of him lingered elsewhere, in a place no one else could reach. Then, one evening, an event occurred that shattered any remaining illusions of normalcy. The town's church bell, cast in iron and silent since the war's end, began to toll at midnight. The sound was deep and mournful, echoing through the empty streets, waking every soul in Ashford. The townspeople gathered in the square, searching for the source, but the bell tower was empty, its doors locked from within. As the final peal faded, a cold wind swept through the town, extinguishing every lamp and candle. In the sudden darkness, a single figure stood at the edge of the square. Timothy, his eyes shining in the moonlight, his face calm and inscrutable. No one spoke, no one moved. The silence was absolute, broken only by the distant cry of a night bird. In that moment, the people of Ashford understood that something had entered their world that defied explanation, something that science could not touch. The questions that had haunted them now burned brighter than ever. Who or what was Timothy Caldwell, and what would happen to their town now that he had arrived? In the days following the midnight tolling of the church bell, Ashford was a town transformed. The air itself seemed charged, as if every breath carried a trace of the uncanny. People moved through the streets with a new wariness, glancing over their shoulders, speaking in hushed tones. The Abernathy house became the axis around which the town's anxiety spun, its windows watched by 100 curious eyes. Timothy Caldwell, once a nameless foundling, was now the subject of every conversation, every rumor, every whispered prayer. Fear and fascination warred within the hearts of Ashford's people. Some clung to reason, desperate to explain away the strangeness. Dr. Morton, his pride wounded by the failed examinations, doubled down on his scientific resolve. He began keeping a journal, meticulously recording every detail of Timothy's behavior, every odd occurrence, every symptom that might yield a rational answer. He visited the Abernathy house daily, sometimes twice, armed with new instruments and theories. There must be a cause, he insisted to anyone who would listen. No child is beyond the reach of science. Yet even he could not explain the way his thermometer fogged in Timothy's presence, or why his pocket watch stopped whenever the boy entered the room. Others, less anchored by logic, turned to older explanations. Mrs. Hargrove, the schoolmaster's wife, was the first to speak openly of witchcraft. She recalled stories from her grandmother, tales of changelings and fairy children, of omens and curses. Soon, she was joined by others, Mrs. Pike, who claimed to have seen Timothy's shadow move against the direction of the sun. Old Man Tully, who swore the boy's eyes glowed in the dark. The church pews filled on Sundays, the congregation praying for deliverance from evil. Pastor Whitcomb, who had once dismissed such talk as superstition, now thundered from the pulpit about vigilance and the dangers of the unknown. "We are tested," he declared, his voice echoing off the stone walls. "We must not let fear drive us to sin, but neither can we ignore the signs." Between these poles of reason and superstition, a third group emerged, those who saw opportunity in the mystery. Mr. Griggs, the owner of the general store, began selling charms and talismans, claiming they would protect against unnatural influences. He stocked his shelves with salt, iron nails, and sprigs of rowan, and business boomed. The local newspaper, run by the ambitious young Miss Eliza Crane, published sensational stories about Timothy, each headline more lurid than the last. "The Boy Who Stopped Time," one read. "Ashford's Miracle or Menace." Another, "Outsiders," began to arrive, drawn by the rumors. A traveling preacher with a talent for exorcisms, a pair of self-styled spiritualists from Boston, even a reporter from the Hartford Courant. Each came seeking answers or a story to sell. Within the town, alliances shifted and old friendships strained under the weight of suspicion. Mrs. Abernathy, once beloved for her charity, now found herself the subject of gossip and thinly veiled accusations. Some said she was bewitched, others that she was hiding something. Children were forbidden to play near her house, and the market women crossed themselves when she passed. Yet a few, moved by pity or stubbornness, stood by her side. Young Sarah Pike, whose brother had found Timothy, brought him books and sweets. Undeterred by her mother's warnings, the blacksmith, Mr. Doyle, gruff and practical, declared that the boy's just different, that's all, and threatened to thrash anyone who said otherwise. Timothy himself remained an enigma. He moved through the days with quiet grace, helping Mrs. Abernathy in the garden, reading by the window, answering questions with gentle courtesy. He seemed untouched by the storms swirling around him, yet there were moments fleeting, easily missed when a shadow crossed his face, a flicker of sorrow or fear. He watched the townspeople with a kind of distant compassion, as if he understood their fear and forgave it. When asked about the church bell, he only shook his head, his eyes clouded with something like regret. The tension in Ashford grew with each passing day. The rationalists and the superstitious eyed each other with suspicion, each convinced the other was courting disaster. The opportunists fanned the flames, eager for profit or notoriety. And beneath it all, a deeper current of dread ran through the town, a sense that something fundamental had shifted, that the world was no longer as safe or as knowable as it had once seemed. One evening, as the sun set behind the pines and the sky burned with the colors of blood and fire, a meeting was called in the town hall. The room was packed, the air thick with fear and anticipation. Dr. Morton spoke first, urging calm and patience, insisting that more tests were needed. Mrs. Hargrove countered with warnings of witchcraft, her voice trembling with conviction. Mr. Griggs argued for vigilance, suggesting that Timothy be watched at all times. Mrs. Abernathy, her hands folded in her lap, spoke quietly of kindness and mercy, reminding the town of their duty to care for the lost and the vulnerable. The debate raged for hours, voices rising and falling, tempers flaring and cooling. In the end, no consensus was reached. The town was divided, its fragile unity shattered by fear and uncertainty. As the meeting broke up and the people filed out into the night, a sense of foreboding settled over Ashford, feeling that the worst was yet to come. And all the while, Timothy Caldwell sat in the attic window, watching the lanterns flicker. In the darkness, his face illuminated by the pale, unearthly light of the moon. What did he see, looking down on the town that both feared and needed him? What secrets did he hold, locked behind those silver eyes? The answers, if they existed, remained just out of reach, waiting for the moment when fear would tip into something far more dangerous. The rumours swirling through Ashford soon outgrew the town's borders, carried on the wind to neighbouring villages and, eventually, to the great cities beyond. It was not long before the story of Timothy Caldwell, the boy who defied explanation, the ears of those who considered themselves the arbiters of truth, the scientists, the doctors, the men of learning who believed that every mystery could be unravelled with the right tools and enough determination. The first to arrive was Dr. Horace Bellamy, a physician of some renown from Boston, whose reputation for solving medical enigmas had earned him the nickname the Modern Galen. He came with a leather satchel brimming with instruments, stethoscopes, thermometers, scalpels, and vials of strange-smelling chemicals. He was followed by Professor Edwin Larch, a natural philosopher from Harvard, whose lectures on the boundaries of human physiology had drawn crowds from as far as New Haven. With them came a retinue of assistants, note-takers, and a young woman named Miss Clara Finch, a prodigy in the new science of psychology, whose presence was itself a curiosity in the mal-dominated world of academia. Their arrival was met with a mixture of hope and suspicion. The rationalists of Ashford welcomed them eagerly, certain that the weight of science would dispel the fog of fear. The superstitious, however, eyed the newcomers with distrust, muttering that meddling with the unknown could only bring disaster. The opportunists saw a chance for profit, offering rooms, meals, and even guided tours of the Abernathy house at inflated prices. The scientists wasted no time. Dr. Bellamy conducted a thorough physical examination, his hands steady, his questions brisk. He measured Timothy's height and weight, tested his reflexes, and examined his eyes, ears, and throat. He drew blood this time, managing to collect a few precious drops, which he sealed in a glass vial for later analysis. Professor Larch observed Timothy's movements, noting the peculiar grace with which he walked, the way he seemed to glide rather than step. Miss Finch spoke to Timothy in gentle tones, asking about his dreams, his memories, his fears. Timothy answered as best he could, his voice soft but clear, his eyes never leaving hers. For days, the scientists worked in shifts, subjecting Timothy to a battery of tests. They measured his pulse at rest and under exertion, recorded his temperature, morning and night, and charted the patterns of his sleep. They exposed him to bright lights, loud noises, and sudden changes in temperature, searching for any sign of abnormality. They tested his memory, his reasoning, his ability to solve puzzles, and recite passages from books. Each result was carefully recorded, each anomaly debated and dissected. Yet for all their efforts, the answers remained elusive. Timothy's vital signs were, for the most part, within normal ranges except for his pulse, which remained stubbornly slow, and his temperature, which hovered just below what was considered healthy. His blood, when examined under Professor Larch's microscope, appeared ordinary, though the cells seemed to move with an unusual vigor. His mind was sharp, his memory flawless, his reasoning impeccable. But there were moments fleeting, inexplicable, when the instruments failed. The thermometer would refuse to register a reading. The stethoscope would pick up a second, fainter heartbeat. The clock would stop ticking altogether. The scientists argued late into the night, their voices echoing through the halls of the inn. Dr. Bellamy insisted that there must be a physiological explanation, perhaps a rare disorder or a mutation yet to be catalogued. Professor Larch speculated about environmental factors, suggesting that something in the air or water of Ashford might be responsible. Miss Finch, more attuned to the subtleties of human behavior, wondered if Timothy's strangeness was a response to trauma, a defense against a world that had already proven itself cruel and unpredictable. But as the days passed and the anomalies persisted, frustration began to set in. The townspeople watched the scientists with a mixture of awe and skepticism, their faith in reason slowly eroding. The rationalists grew restless, demanding answers, The superstitious grew, emboldened, pointing to each failed experiment as proof that Timothy was not of this world. The opportunists, sensing a shift in the wind, began to hedge their bets, offering prayers as readily as they sold charms. The contrast between science and superstition became a living thing in Ashford, a tension that crackled in every conversation, every glance. The scientists, for all their learning, found themselves haunted by doubts. Dr. Bellamy, once so certain, began to avoid Timothy's gaze, his hands trembling as he wrote his notes. Professor Large, who had scoffed at the idea of the supernatural, now found himself waking in the night, convinced he had heard Timothy's voice whispering in the darkness. Miss Finch, who prided herself on her empathy, felt a growing sense of unease, as if she was standing at the edge of a precipice, peering into an abyss that threatened to swallow her whole. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the town was bathed in the blue light of dusk, the scientists gathered in the Abernathy parlor to discuss their findings. The room was heavy with disappointment, the air thick with the scent of candle wax and old wood. Dr. Bellamy spoke first, his voice weary. "We have done all we can," he said. "There is no disease, no injury, no defect that can account for what we have seen. Timothy Caldwell is, by every measure, a healthy boy." And yet he trailed off, unable to finish the thought. Professor Larch shook his head, his eyes hollow. "We are missing something," he said. "Something fundamental. Perhaps it is not Timothy who is strange, but our understanding that is lacking." Miss Finch looked at Timothy, who sat quietly by the window, his face illuminated by the last rays of sunlight. "What do you remember?" she asked gently. "Where did you come from?" Timothy was silent for a long moment. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he replied, "I remember the dark. I remember the cold. I remember waiting." The scientists exchanged uneasy glances, their confidence shaken. For the first time, they considered the possibility that some mysteries were not meant to be solved, that the world was larger and stranger than they had ever imagined. And so, the inquest ended, not with answers, but with more questions. The scientists packed their instruments and left Ashford, their reputations intact but their certainty forever diminished. The townspeople watched them go, some relieved, others disappointed, all left to grapple with the enigma that remained. Now, I turn to you, the listener. If you had stood in that parlor, if you had seen what they saw, what would you believe? Would you trust the instruments and the theories, or the whispers and the shadows? Would you cling to reason or surrender to fear? Tell me in the comments, what do you think Timothy Caldwell truly was? The departure of the scientists left Ashford in a state of uneasy suspension, as if the town itself were holding its breath, waiting for something to break. The promise of answers had evaporated, replaced by a gnawing sense of dread. The rationalists, once so vocal, grew silent, their faith in science shaken by the inexplicable. The superstitious, emboldened by the failure of reason, began to speak more openly, their whispers swelling into a chorus of suspicion and fear. It started with small things: a broken window at the Abernathy house, a dead crow left on the doorstep, a smear of ash on the garden gate. Mrs. Abernathy, who had always been greeted with smiles and warm words, now found herself shunned at the market, her presence met with averted eyes and muttered prayers. Children, once curious about Timothy, now crossed the street to avoid him, their games turning cruel as they dared each other to run past the house or shout insults from a safe distance. The town's sense of community, already fragile, began to fracture, suspicion seeping into every conversation, every glance. Rumors multiplied like weeds. Some claimed to have seen Timothy walking the woods at midnight, his eyes glowing like lanterns. Others swore he could speak to animals, or that he had been seen standing in the graveyard, conversing with shadows. The old stories resurfaced, tales of changelings, of omens, of children who brought ruin to those who sheltered them. The line between memory and imagination blurred, each retelling more vivid, more terrifying than the last. The church became the epicenter of the town's anxiety. Pastor Whitcomb, once a voice of moderation, now thundered from the pulpit about the dangers of harboring evil. "We are beset by darkness," he proclaimed, his voice echoing through the nave. "We must root it out, or be consumed." The congregation, desperate for certainty, clung to his words, their prayers growing louder, more fervent, as if volume alone could drive away the unknown. It was in this atmosphere of fear that the first act of violence occurred. One night, a group of young men emboldened by drink and the safety of numbers gathered outside the Abernathy house. They hurled stones at the windows, shouting curses and threats. Mrs. Abernathy, trembling with fear, barred the doors and hid Timothy. In the attic, her heart pounding with each crash of glass. The mob dispersed before dawn, but the message was clear. Timothy was no longer merely a curiosity. He was a threat. The incident marked a turning point. The town's fear, once diffuse, now crystallized into something harder, more dangerous. The rationalists, unable to offer comfort or explanation, retreated into silence. The superstitious, their worst fears, seemingly confirmed, called for action. The opportunists, sensing which way the wind was blowing, began to distance themselves from the Abernathy house, their former generosity replaced by cold calculation. Mrs. Abernathy, isolated and afraid, watched as her world shrank to the four walls of her home. She tried to shield Timothy from the growing hostility, but the boy sensed the change. He moved more quietly, kept to the shadows, his eyes dark with worry. He asked fewer questions, spoke less, his once gentle smile now rare and fleeting. The house, once filled with warmth and laughter, became a place of silence and dread. The psychological horror of isolation took its toll. Mrs. Abernathy found herself jumping at every sound, her sleep broken by nightmares of fire and shouting. She began to doubt her own memories. Had Timothy always been so strange, or had the town's fear infected her, too? She caught herself watching him, searching for signs of the supernatural, her love for the boy warring with the seed of doubt planted by her neighbors. The town, meanwhile, spiraled further into hysteria. Every misfortune was laid at Timothy's feet: a failed harvest, a sick child, a barn fire on the edge of town. The stories grew wilder, the accusations more desperate. Some called for Timothy to be sent away, others for more drastic measures. The word which was spoken openly now, the old laws and punishments whispered in the dark. A meeting was called in the town square, the air thick with anger and fear. Pastor Whitcomb led the assembly, his voice ringing with righteous fury. "We have been patient," he declared. "We have tried reason, we have tried kindness, but the evil remains. We must act or be destroyed." The crowd, whipped into a frenzy, shouted their agreement, their faces twisted by fear and hatred. Mrs. Abernathy, hearing the commotion, knew what was coming. She gathered Timothy and fled to the attic, barring the door behind them. The mob approached, torches in hand, their voices a rising tide of rage. They pounded on the door, demanding Timothy be brought out, their words a jumble of accusation and threat. Inside, Timothy sat quietly, his hands folded in his lap, his eyes calm. "It's all right, Mrs. Abernathy," he said softly. "They're afraid, that's all." She clung to him, her tears falling silently, her heart breaking with fear and helplessness. The pounding grew louder, the shouts more insistent. The house shook with the force of the mob, the air thick with smoke and fear. Mrs. Abernathy closed her eyes, praying for a miracle, for deliverance, for anything that might save the boy she had come to love as her own. And then, as if in answer, a sudden silence fell. The mob, caught in the act of violence, froze as a cold wind swept through the square, extinguishing every torch, every lantern. The darkness was absolute, impenetrable, a living thing that pressed against the skin and filled the lungs. In that moment, every person in Ashford felt the weight of their fear, the horror of what they had become. When the light returned, the mob found themselves scattered, their anger spent, their courage gone. The Abernathy house stood silent, its windows dark, its doors unbroken. Timothy and Mrs. Abernathy were nowhere to be found. The town, shaken and ashamed, was left to reckon with what they had done. The hysteria had passed, but the scars remained a reminder of how quickly fear could turn neighbor against neighbor, and how easily the unknown could become a target for the darkest parts of the human soul. But Timothy Caldwell, the boy science, couldn't explain, had vanished into the night, leaving behind only questions and a town forever changed. Dawn broke over Ashford with a hush, as if the world itself was holding its breath. The town, still reeling from the night's terror, awoke to a silence so profound it seemed unnatural. The Abernathy house stood empty, its doors ajar, the garden trampled by desperate feet. No sign of Timothy or Mrs. Abernathy remained, no footprints in the dew, no trace of hurried flight. Only the faint scent of ozone lingered in the air, sharp and metallic, as if lightning had struck in the night. For hours, the townspeople searched. They combed the woods, scoured the riverbanks, and peered into every shadowed corner. The bravest among them ventured into the attic, where they found Mrs. Abernathy's shawl folded neatly on the bed, and a single white feather resting on the windowsill. The feather was unlike any birds they had ever seen, long and iridescent, shimmering, with colors that seemed to shift in the light. Some swore it was warm to the touch, others that it hummed with a faint, electric energy. The object became an instant relic, passed from hand to hand, each person hoping to divine some meaning from its impossible beauty. As the day wore on, the searchers grew weary, their hope fading with the sun. It was then, in the late afternoon, that young Sarah Pike stumbled upon something extraordinary. She had wandered farther than the others, drawn by a strange compulsion, a whisper at the edge of hearing. In a clearing deep within the woods, she found a circle of scorched earth, the grass burned away in a perfect ring. At its center stood Timothy, alone and unafraid, his face turned toward the sky. He looked different, older, somehow, and yet untouched by time. His hair glimmered in the sunlight, and his eyes, once grey, now shone with a light that was almost unbearable to look at. Around him, the air shimmered, distorting the world as if seen through water. Sarah called his name, her voice trembling, but Timothy only smiled, smile filled with sorrow and something like relief. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice echoing in the stillness. "I never meant to hurt anyone. I only wanted to belong." Before Sarah could move, a wind rose. From nowhere, swirling around the clearing, lifting leaves and dust in a wild dance. The light grew brighter, pulsing with a rhythm that seemed to match the beating of her heart. For a moment, Sarah glimpsed shapes in the light, figures tall and indistinct, their faces hidden, their eyes shining with the same impossible brilliance as Timothy's. She felt a presence, vast and ancient, brush against her mind, filling her with awe and terror in equal measure. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the wind died. The light faded. Timothy was gone. Sarah collapsed to her knees, her breath coming in ragged gasps. When she looked up, the clearing was empty, the circle of scorched earth the only sign that anything had happened at all. She stumbled back to town, clutching the feather she had found at her feet, her mind reeling with questions she could not begin to answer. Word of Sarah's discovery spread quickly. The townspeople gathered in the square, listening in stunned silence as she recounted what she had seen. Some wept openly, others fell to their knees in prayer, a few unable to accept. The truth accused Sarah of lying, of being bewitched, but the feather, passed from hand to hand, silenced even the most skeptical. Its existence was undeniable, its meaning unfathomable. In the days that followed, Ashford was a town transformed. The fear that had once united them now gave way to a strange, reverent awe. The church bell, silent for so long, rang out at dawn and dusk, its tolling a reminder of the mystery that had touched their lives. The Abernathy house was left undisturbed, its windows shuttered, its garden left to grow wild. Some said they saw Mrs. Abernathy in the fields at twilight, her figure wreathed in mist, her face serene. Others claimed to hear Timothy's laughter in the wind, or to glimpse his shadow at the edge of the woods. Dr. Morton, shaken to his core, left Ashford soon after, his faith in science forever altered. Pastor Whitcomb, humbled by the events, preached sermons of humility and wonder, urging his flock to embrace the unknown with open hearts. The opportunists found their wares unsellable, their stories suddenly small and tawdry in the face of what had happened. Yet for all the changes, many questions remained. Who or what was Timothy Caldwell? Was he a child of the stars, a messenger, a warning? Had he come to Ashford by accident, or had the town been chosen for reasons beyond human understanding? And what of the feather, the circle of scorched earth, the figures in the light? Were they signs of something greater, or simply the last traces of a mystery that would never be solved? The people of Ashford would debate these questions for generations, each retelling of the story adding new details, new interpretations. Some found comfort in the mystery, others only fear. But all agreed on one thing. Timothy Caldwell had changed them. He had shown them the limits of their knowledge, the dangers of their fear, and the possibility that the world was far stranger, more wondrous than they had ever imagined. And so, the story of Timothy Caldwell passed into legend, a tale told by candlelight on stormy nights, a warning and a promise. For in the end, some mysteries are not meant to be solved. Some truths are too vast, too beautiful, too terrible to be contained by reason or faith. And sometimes, the only answer is to stand in awe and let the unknown pass through you like a dream. In the weeks and months that followed Timothy Caldwell's disappearance, Ashford became a town suspended between memory and myth. The fever of hysteria had broken, but in its place was a silence that felt almost sacred, a hush that settled over the streets, the fields, and the woods where the boy had last been seen. The townspeople moved through their days with a new wariness, as if the world itself had grown larger and more uncertain. The Abernathy house, once the heart of the storm, stood empty and untouched. No one dared claim it, nor did anyone disturb the wild tangle of garden that grew unchecked around its walls. Some said Mrs. Abernathy had been seen wandering the fields. At dusk, her figure blurred by mist, her face unreadable. Others believed she had left Ashford altogether, unable to bear the weight of what had happened. Her absence was a wound that never quite healed, a reminder of the cost of kindness in a world ruled by fear. For the townspeople, the aftermath was a time of reckoning. The events of that spring and summer became a mirror in which they saw themselves, both the best and the worst. Some, racked with guilt, tried to make amends. They tended the Abernathy garden, left offerings of bread and flowers at the doorstep, and spoke in hushed voices of forgiveness and regret. Others, unable to face their own actions, retreated into denial, insisting that Timothy had been nothing more than a troubled orphan, that the strange events had been tricks of the light and mind. The children of Ashford, who had once taunted Timothy, now played quietly, their games subdued, their laughter tinged with unease. They told stories of the boy who vanished, embellishing the tale with each retelling, but always ending with the same question: would he ever return? The adults, for their part, found themselves haunted by dreams of circles of scorched earth, of feathers that glowed in the moonlight, of voices calling from the edge of sleep. The scientists who had come to Ashford left with more questions than answers. Dr. Bellamy, his confidence shaken, withdrew from public life. his journals filled with observations he could not explain. Professor Larch published a single paper on the Ashford phenomenon, but it was met with skepticism and ridicule, dismissed as the ramblings of a man seduced by superstition. Miss Finch, the young psychologist, never spoke of Timothy again. But those who knew her said she was changed quieter, more contemplative, her eyes shadowed by things she could not name. The town's faith in science, once so strong, was tempered by humility. The rationalists, chastened by their failure to explain Timothy, became more cautious in their judgments. The superstitious, vindicated by the inexplicable, grew bolder in their beliefs, but even they sensed that what had happened was beyond the reach of old charms and prayers. The opportunists, their prophets, dried up, faded into the background, their stories now little more than echoes. Yet for all that was lost, something was gained as well. Ashford became a place where questions were valued as much as answers, where wonder and fear coexisted in uneasy harmony. The church bell, once a symbol of certainty, now tolled for the unknown, its sound a reminder that some mysteries are meant to endure. The feather found in the attic was placed in a glass case in the town hall, a relic of the impossible, a testament to the limits of human understanding. The emotional and psychological scars ran deep. Trust, once broken, was slow to return. Neighbors eyed each other with a new caution, wary of the darkness that could take root in any heart. But there was also a quiet resilience, a determination to remember what had happened, not as a warning, but as a lesson. The story of Timothy Caldwell became a touchstone, a way for the town to measure itself against the unknown. What had they learned? That fear, left unchecked, could turn even the kindest souls into monsters. That compassion was a fragile thing, easily crushed by suspicion. That science, for all its power, was not infallible, and that some truths lay forever beyond its reach. But also that the world was stranger and more beautiful than they had ever imagined, and that sometimes the only way forward was to accept the mystery and live with the questions. And so, life in Ashford went on. The seasons turned, the fields bloomed and withered, and the story of Timothy Caldwell faded into legend. But in the quiet moments, when the wind rustled through the pines or the church bell tolled at dusk, the people of Ashford remembered. They remembered the boy's science, couldn't explain, and the way he had changed them all forever. What remains, after the fever of fear and the hush of wonder, is a story that refuses to settle into certainty. The tale of Timothy Caldwell lingers in the mind like a half-remembered dream, a reminder that the world is not as simple as we wish it to be. In Ashford, the boundaries between science and superstition, reason and terror, were tested and found wanting. The town's brightest minds, armed with instruments and theories, could not pierce the veil of the unknown. Their failure was not just a failure of knowledge, but a humbling of pride, a lesson in the limits of human understanding. Yet, perhaps the greater lesson lies in the town's reaction. Fear, once kindled, spread like wildfire, consuming compassion, and turning neighbor against neighbor. The cost of othering, of casting out what we do not understand, was paid in shame and sorrow. How easy it is, when faced with the inexplicable, to reach for blame, to seek safety in the exclusion of the strange. How quickly a community can become a mob, and how slowly it learns to heal. But what if Ashford had chosen differently? What if, instead of fear, the town had met Timothy with patience and curiosity? What if science had been humble enough to admit its limits, and faith gentle enough to embrace the unknown? Would the outcome have changed, or are some mysteries destined to remain unsolved, no matter how we approach them? And what of Timothy himself? Was he a miracle, a warning, or simply a child lost between worlds? Can everything be explained, given enough time and knowledge, or are there truths that will always elude us? Is the unknown something to be feared, or a space for wonder and growth? Now, I turn these questions to you. If you had lived in Ashford, what would you have done? Would you have opened your door to Timothy or turned him away? Do you believe that every mystery has an answer, or do you accept that some things are meant to remain beyond our grasp? Share your thoughts, your theories, your own stories of the unexplainable in the comments below, for in the end, it is not the answers that bind us together, but the questions we dare to ask and the courage to face the darkness together. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the shadows of Ashford and into the heart of a mystery that still echoes through time. The story of Timothy Caldwell is more than a tale of the unexplained. It's a mirror held up to our own fears, our hopes, and the fragile line between what we know and what we can only imagine. If you found yourself haunted by Timothy's fate or questioning the choices of the townspeople, you're not alone. These are the stories that linger, that challenge us to look deeper and to wonder what we might do if the unknown ever knocked at our own door. If you enjoyed this story, I invite you to subscribe and become part of this community of seekers, skeptics, and storytellers. Your thoughts and theories are what make these mysteries come alive, so don't forget to leave a comment below. What do you think really happened to Timothy Caldwell? Have you ever encountered something science couldn't explain? I read every story, and your voice is part of what makes this channel a place for curiosity and courage. And if you're hungry for more, you won't want to miss what's coming next. There are more stories out there, tales of haunted minds, forgotten tragedies, and secrets that refuse to stay buried. Some are darker, some stranger, and all of them will leave you questioning the world you thought you knew. So, are you ready to hear them? Hit subscribe, turn on notifications, and join me next time as we step once more into the unknown. Because there are more stories science can't explain, and the next one might be even closer than you think.